Viewer discretion is advised. This presentation details a brutal and violent crime involving adults and children. The content may be disturbing to some audiences. It was just after sunrise on a quiet Sunday morning in the Sierra Nevada mountains. 14-year-old Sheila Sharp pushed open the door to Cabin 28, expecting to find her younger brothers still asleep. Instead, she walked into a slaughterhouse. Sprawled across the living room floor were 3 bodies, bound with electrical wire and medical tape. The scene was so drenched in blood, the carpet appeared to be painted red. Her mother, Sue, her older brother, John, and John's friend, Dana. They had been bludgeoned with a hammer and stabbed with such ferocity that one of the knives was found bent at a 30-degree angle. But as Sheila stood there, frozen in terror, the most chilling realization washed over her. Her 12-year-old sister, Tina, was nowhere to be found. And in the very next room, her 2 youngest brothers, ages 10 and 5, were found sleeping in their beds, completely unharmed. They hadn't heard a thing. How can 3 people be brutally murdered in a small wooden cabin without waking the children sleeping just a few feet away? For over 40 years, this question has haunted investigators. They found a murder weapon. They had eyewitness sketches. They even received a confession letter naming the killers. So why does the case of the Keddie Cabin Murders officially remain unsolved? The answer is far more disturbing than the crime itself, suggesting a cover-up that reached the highest levels of local law enforcement, protecting a killer who was hiding in plain sight. To understand what happened in Cabin 28, you first have to understand Keddie. In the spring of 1981, Keddie, California, was a ghost of its former self. Tucked away in the dense forests of Plumas County, it was once a bustling railroad town, a hub of logging and industry. But by the 80s, the boom was over. The Grand Keddie Resort, once a majestic mountain getaway, had fallen into disrepair. Its main lodge shuttered. The remaining cabins were converted into low-income housing, attracting a transient population of families down on their luck, all seeking a cheap place to live and a fresh start. It was a place of isolation, where the towering pines could feel less like a scenic backdrop and more like a cage. A place where everyone knew their neighbors, but no one really knew what went on behind closed doors. This is the world Glenna Sue Sharp and her 5 children entered just a few months before the murders. At 36 years old, Sue was a single mother who had just fled an abusive husband in Connecticut, driving across the country with her kids in search of peace. She was a survivor determined to build a new life. Her oldest, John, was 15, a typical teenager on the cusp of manhood. 14-year-old Sheila was responsible and caring. 12-year-old Tina was known for her bright, curious nature. And then there were the 2 youngest, 10-year-old Rick and 5-year-old Greg. Cabin 28 wasn't much. A small 2-bedroom wooden structure, but for the Sharps it was a sanctuary. A place to heal. They had no idea they had moved into the heart of a nightmare. Saturday, April 11, 1981, began like any other day in the quiet resort. That afternoon, Sue drove Sheila and her friend to a neighboring town for a sleepover. She then returned to Keddie, where John and his 16-year-old friend, Dana Wingate, were planning to hang out for the evening. The 2 boys were last seen around 9:30 that night, hitchhiking up the main road back toward the Keddie Resort. Around the same time, Sue left the younger children, Tina, Rick, and Greg, at home to watch television while she went to a party at the resort's bar. She returned home around 1:30 in the morning, escorted by 2 men she had been talking with. She was last seen alive by her neighbor, who watched her walk into Cabin 28. The lights went out shortly after. The mountain fell silent. The next morning, Sheila returned home around 8 o'clock. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual. Stepping inside, she was met with a scene of pure, unadulterated carnage. The living room was in chaos. Furniture was overturned, a chair was shattered, and blood was smeared on the walls, the ceiling, everywhere. Her mother, Sue, was lying on the floor, gagged with her own underwear in a blue bandana, held in place by a tangle of electrical cord. She had been stabbed repeatedly and bludgeoned in the head. Lying near her were the bodies of John and Dana. They too had been bound, their hands and feet tied together. They had been beaten with a hammer and Dana had been manually strangled. The brutality was personal, it was intimate. It was rage. Sheila ran screaming from the cabin to a neighbor's home, and the Plumas County Sheriff's Department was called. When deputies arrived, the horror only deepened. As they cautiously moved through the blood-soaked living room, they made a discovery that defied all logic. In the back bedroom, they found Rick, Greg, and a young friend of theirs, Justin Smart, who had been sleeping over. They were alive. They were physically untouched. 3 young boys had slept through a massacre happening in the room right next to them. When questioned, they claimed they saw and heard nothing. It was an impossibility that became the first, and perhaps most baffling mystery of the case. But one person was still missing, 12-year-old Tina Sharp. An immediate search of the cabin and the surrounding woods turned up nothing. There was no sign of a struggle in her room, no indication she had been taken by force. She had simply vanished from a sealed crime scene. Investigators were now facing a quadruple homicide with a potential kidnapping. The small, under-equipped Plumas County Sheriff's Department was completely overwhelmed. The initial handling of the crime scene was, by modern standards, a catastrophe. The scene wasn't properly secured. People, including family members, were allowed to wander in and out. Evidence was contaminated, overlooked, or simply lost. One of the murder weapons, a bloody steak knife, was on the kitchen counter. Another knife and a bloody hammer were found outside the back door. But the police work was so disorganized that the hammer, a key piece of evidence, wasn't even taken into evidence until 3 years later, when a new sheriff took over the case. The autopsies confirmed the sheer violence of the attacks. Sue, John, and Dana had all suffered extensive blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with blows from a claw hammer. They had also been stabbed multiple times. The bindings were complex, suggesting the killers had time, and were confident they wouldn't be interrupted. The medical tape used was of a specific type, the kind that might be used in a hospital or by a military medic. The electrical wire was also distinctive. These were clues. They pointed to someone with a specific skill set, someone who knew how to incapacitate and control their victims. As news of the murder spread through the tiny community of Keddie, a wave of fear and paranoia took hold. This wasn't a random act of violence. The killers hadn't broken in. There was no sign of forced entry. This meant the Sharps likely knew their attackers. They had let them in. The people of Keddie looked at their neighbors with suspicion. The killer or killers were still among them. The police began their interviews, and a picture started to form of the social web in this isolated community. A web of troubled relationships, drug use, and simmering tensions. And their attention quickly turned to a family living just 2 cabins down from the Sharps. A family with a violent history and a direct connection to Sue Sharp. A man named Martin Smart, and his friend John Bobubaid. And Martin Smart just happened to be the stepfather of Justin, the young boy who had been sleeping over at the Sharps' cabin that night, and who claimed to have seen nothing. This connection, this seemingly small detail of a sleepover, would eventually tear the entire case wide open. But in 1981, it was just another loose thread in a tapestry of confusion. To understand why Martin Smart and John Bubaid became the prime suspects, we have to understand who they were. And more importantly, we have to listen to the one person who claimed to know exactly what happened that night. Martin's wife, Marilyn. Martin Smart was a local man, a veteran, and by many accounts, a man with a dangerously short fuse. He and Marilyn were neighbors of the Sharps, living just a few cabins down. Their relationship was reportedly volatile, filled with arguments and, according to Marilyn, violence. Martin knew the Sharp family. He knew Sue, and he allegedly had a strange and possessive interest in her. Some reports suggest he was trying to counsel her, to guide her after her recent separation from her husband. But Marilyn would later claim this counseling was a cover for an obsession, an unhealthy fixation that had been simmering for weeks. And then there was John Bubaid. Bo, as he was called, was not from Keddie. He was an outsider, a friend Martin Smart had met at a VA hospital in Reno. Bubaid was a shadowy figure, a man with a rap sheet and rumored ties to organized crime in Chicago. He was a drifter, a man with no real reason to be in a tiny, isolated mountain town like Keddie, other than his friendship with Martin Smart. He had only been in town for a few weeks when the murders occurred. Together, they made an odd and intimidating pair. The volatile local with a temper, and his mysterious, imposing friend with a dark past. The night of April 11th, Martin Smart and Bo Bubaid were at the Keddie Resort's bar. This is a fact. Multiple witnesses saw them there. But what happened after they left is the subject of a story so chilling. It's hard to believe it was ignored for so long. This story comes directly from Marilyn Smart. Years after the murders, Marilyn finally came forward with an account of that night that painted her husband and his friend as the killers. She claimed that Martin and Bo came storming back to their cabin late that night. She said Martin was furious. He had been at the bar and had seen Sue Sharp dancing with another man. In his mind, this was a betrayal. His attempts to counsel her to get close to her had been rejected. Marilyn said he left the bar in a rage, with Bo right beside him, and they went over to cabin 28 to confront Sue. What Marilyn described next is the stuff of nightmares. She said sometime later Martin and Bo returned. They were different. Something had happened. She claimed they were trying to burn something in their wood stove, and that Martin openly confessed to her. He allegedly told her, "I killed her. I killed the woman and I killed her kids." He told her that his intended target was Sue, but that her son Johnny had walked in on the attack, and he had to be silenced. Dana, too, had tried to intervene and met the same fate. According to Marilyn, Martin admitted that he and Bo had committed the murders, and that if she ever told anyone, he would kill her too. He told her she knew too much, and that her silence was the only thing keeping her alive. For years, Marilyn stayed silent, terrified of her husband. But her story wasn't the only one. There was another witness, the one who was right there in the room, seemingly asleep through the entire massacre. Her son Justin. The day after the murders, when Sheila Sharp discovered the horrific scene, she also found Justin Smart and the two younger Sharp boys physically unharmed in the adjacent bedroom. Justin, when questioned by police, claimed he'd slept through the whole thing. He said he hadn't heard a thing. Seemed impossible. The attacks were brutal, bloody, and certainly not quiet. How could a 12-year-old boy sleep through a quadruple homicide happening just a few feet away? The investigators at the time seemed to accept his story. He was just a kid, maybe he was a heavy sleeper, maybe he was in shock. But later, a therapist who was working with Justin decided to try something controversial: a hypnosis session. Under hypnosis, a new and terrifying story emerged. Justin recounted the night of the murders. He said he hadn't been asleep the whole time. He said he woke up. In the trance-like state, Justin described seeing two men in the living room of cabin 28. He saw Sue Sharp arguing with them. He described one of the men as having a mustache and long hair. The other, he said, was clean-shaven with short hair. He watched as the argument escalated into a fight. He saw one of the men grab Sue, and he saw Johnny run in to try and help his mother. He then described a horrifying scene of Johnny and Sue being attacked. He saw a girl, who he identified as Tina, walk in through the back door. One of the men grabbed her and took her back out the way she came. And then Justin made the most chilling identification of all. When asked who the two men were, he named them. One was his stepfather, Martin Smart. The other was his stepfather's friend, Bo Bubaid. He claimed that after they took Tina, the two men saw him. They saw that he was awake. He said they approached him, and one of them threw a blanket over his head and told him to go back to sleep, warning him that if he ever said anything, he would be next. So now you have two separate accounts, one from a terrified wife and one from a traumatized child under hypnosis, both pointing the finger at the very same two men, Martin Smart and John Bubaid. Marilyn Smart even told the sheriff's department about her husband's confession shortly after the murders. She claims she went to Sheriff Doug Thomas and told him everything. And what was the response? According to her, she was told to keep her mouth shut, that if she went public with the accusation, she'd be the one who ended up dead. The official investigation seemed to go nowhere with this information. Martin Smart was questioned, of course. He was given a polygraph test, which sources close to the investigation say he failed spectacularly. Yet he was let go. He wrote a letter to Marilyn from a nearby town shortly after, a letter that was both pathetic and menacing. He wrote, "I've paid the price of your love and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives." A sentence that sounds an awful lot like a confession. The evidence, it seemed, was piling up. A confession to his wife, a corroborating story from his stepson, a failed polygraph, a cryptic, incriminating letter, and a clear motive of jealousy and rage. It begs the question that has haunted this case for over 40 years. If law enforcement had all of this information pointing directly to Martin Smart and Bo Bubaid in 1981, why were they never arrested? Why was this seemingly overwhelming evidence ignored, dismissed, and buried for decades? The answer to that question is even more disturbing than the crime itself, suggesting a cover-up that went far beyond just a botched investigation. To understand the rot at the core of the Keddie investigation, you have to understand the town itself. Keddie and Plumas County as a whole was a small insular community in the early 1980s. This wasn't a place where everyone was a stranger. It was a place where the sheriff might have gone to high school with the man he was supposed to be investigating. A place where personal loyalties could be thicker than blood, and certainly thicker than the rule of law. And at the center of this web of questionable loyalties were two men, Martin Smart and his friend John Bubaid. Martin, or Marty Smart, was a local. He lived in Cabin 26, right next door to the Sharps. He was married to a woman named Marilyn, and they had children of their own. On the surface, he was just another neighbor, but underneath, Marty had a reputation. He was known for having a violent temper, a short fuse that could be lit by the smallest spark. He was also, by many accounts, intensely jealous and controlling, particularly when it came to his wife, Marilyn. And crucially, he knew the Sharps. He knew Sue and he knew the kids. He had been a guest in their home. His house guest, John Bubaid, was a different story entirely. Bubaid was not from Keddie. He was an outsider, a shadowy figure Marty had met at a Veterans Affairs hospital in Reno. Bubaid was a man with a past, a man who claimed to have connections to the Chicago mob. He carried himself with an air of genuine menace and had a lengthy criminal record, including armed robbery. He was, in short, the kind of person you wouldn't want living next door, especially in a quiet, isolated mountain resort. And on the night of April 11, 1981, he was staying with Marty Smart in Cabin 26. These two men almost immediately became the focus of the investigation, not because of brilliant police work, but because of one person's courage, Marilyn Smart. Just days after the murders, a terrified Marilyn went to the Plumas County Sheriff's Office with a story so chilling, it should have cracked the case wide open right then and there. She told investigators that on the night of the murders, Marty and Bubaid had been out late. She said that her husband had been growing increasingly angry and agitated with Sue Sharp, believing she was interfering in their marriage, encouraging Marilyn to leave him. According to Marilyn, that night, Marty and Bubaid left the cabin together. When they returned hours later, well after midnight, something was terribly wrong. She would later claim they were acting strangely, and that a hammer Marty owned, a hammer that perfectly matched the description of one of the murder weapons, was suddenly missing. This initial report was disturbing enough, but it was what happened later that cemented Marty and Bubaid as the prime suspects. Sometime after the murders, Marty Smart allegedly confessed, not to the police but to his own wife. In a moment of what seemed to be guilt-ridden panic, he told Marilyn that he had killed Sue Sharp. He claimed he didn't mean to kill the children, but that they had seen him and he had to silence them. He implicated Bubaid as his accomplice in the horrific act. Imagine the terror Marilyn must have felt. The man she was married to, the father of her children, had just confessed to a slaughter. She was now a witness to a confession for one of the most brutal crimes in California history. And her husband was not alone. The dangerous ex-con John Bubaid was right there. Both men allegedly threatened her, warning her that if she ever told anyone what she knew, she would be next. They told her she'd end up just like Sue. Despite these terrifying threats, Marilyn did go to the police. She sat down with Sheriff Doug Thomas and laid it all out. She told him about the missing hammer. She told him about the confession. She told him everything. This was it. This was the golden ticket for investigators. An eyewitness account placing the suspects at the scene, a direct confession, a motive, and a missing murder weapon. The case should have been over. But it wasn't. Instead of arresting Martin Smart and John Bubaid, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office did something that, to this day, defies all logic. They gave Martin Smart a polygraph test. Unsurprisingly, he passed. The validity of these early polygraphs is highly questionable, easily manipulated by a subject who knows how. And just like that, based on this flimsy result, Sheriff Doug Thomas seemed to lose all interest in Marty Smart. He was effectively cleared. The confession, the threats, the missing hammer, it was all pushed aside. Why? Why would a sheriff, presented with a confession to a quadruple homicide, simply let the suspect walk away? The answer lies in that small-town dynamic we talked about. Sheriff Doug Thomas and Martin Smart weren't strangers. They were friends. They knew each other well. They spent time together. And many believe that this friendship is the single biggest reason justice was never served in Keddie. The sheriff was protecting his friend. This wasn't just a passive old boys club protection either. The actions taken seemed to suggest a deliberate effort to steer the investigation away from Smart. For instance, a composite sketch was released to the public of one of the suspects. It looked nothing like Marty Smart or John Bubaid. In fact, it looked so different that it sent the investigation on a wild goose chase, focusing on phantom killers who likely never existed. The sketch was based on a description from a neighbor who claimed to have seen men near the cabin, but its accuracy has been heavily disputed. Was this sketch a legitimate lead, or was it a convenient piece of misdirection? The most damning piece of evidence, however, wouldn't surface for years. After Marty confessed to Marilyn, he allegedly did something even more foolish. He wrote her a letter. This letter, which Marilyn kept hidden for decades out of fear, was essentially a written confession. It read in part, "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through. Great. What else do you want?" He wrote it down. He put his guilt on paper and handed it to the one person who could destroy him. And when this letter was finally brought to the attention of law enforcement years later, it was dismissed. It was deemed inconclusive, potentially a forgery, or simply not enough to act on. The original letter has since vanished, becoming another ghost in this case. Another piece of critical evidence lost to either incompetence or corruption. Think about the sheer weight of this. A witness comes forward with a direct confession from her husband. The husband is friends with the sheriff. The husband passes a questionable polygraph and is cleared. A misleading sketch is released to the public, and a handwritten confession is ignored and then disappears. This is not a series of unfortunate mistakes. This is a pattern. It's a clear and disturbing picture of an investigation that wasn't just botched. It was compromised from the very beginning. The goal, it seems, wasn't to find the truth. The goal was to protect Martin Smart. And in protecting him, Sheriff Doug Thomas and the Plumas County Sheriff's Office allowed a monster and his accomplice to get away with murder. But Marty and Bubaid weren't the only people in Cabin 26 that night, and they weren't the only ones with secrets to keep. The official story had another key suspect, a man who was there, who saw everything, and who the police inexplicably decided to ignore for decades. His name was Justin Smart. He was 12 years old, and on the night of April 11, 1981, he was sleeping over at his friend's house in Cabin 28. He was there for a classic childhood sleepover with his friends John and Dana. The 3 boys, along with Justin's younger brother, were all in one of the small bedrooms, separate from the main living area where the carnage would unfold. When the sun rose on April 12th, Justin and the other 2 boys woke up, completely unaware that they had slept through a massacre. They opened their bedroom door, expecting to smell breakfast or hear the sounds of a Sunday morning. Instead, they were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. But in the initial chaos, in the frantic interviews and the flood of police officers, Justin's story was confusing. He couldn't remember anything. He told investigators he'd had a dream about the murders, seeing details of the fight, but he insisted it was just a dream. The police, dealing with a bloody, complex crime scene and a traumatized family, took his statement and largely moved on. A 12-year-old boy who slept through the whole thing and had a bad dream wasn't exactly a star witness, but the dream, it wouldn't go away. The images were too vivid, too specific. And so, a few days after the murders, investigators decided to try something unconventional. They brought in a hypnotist. Under hypnosis, a story began to emerge, fragmented and dreamlike, but terrifyingly real. Justin described seeing 2 men in the cabin. He said he saw his friend Johnny arguing with a man who had a mustache. He saw Sue Sharp enter the room and try to break it up. Then he saw one of the men grab a hammer. He described seeing Johnny and another person, who he thought was Dana Wingate, being physically carried out of the cabin's back door. He heard muffled screaming. When the hypnotist asked him to identify the men, Justin gave a name: Marty. He also described the second man, though he didn't know his name at the time. The details were chilling, but they were obtained through hypnosis, a method that is, to this day, highly controversial and often inadmissible in court. For the Plumas County Sheriff's Department in 1981, it was enough to dismiss it. A dream, a hypnotically induced memory from a terrified kid. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was a dead end, and so, for years it was treated as exactly that. Justin Smart, the only potential eyewitness, was sidelined. But trauma doesn't work on a schedule. Memories don't stay buried forever. They fester. They claw their way to the surface, often years later, in bits and pieces, until the full horrifying picture is finally revealed. For Justin, that revelation came nearly 2 decades later, in the supposed safety of a therapist's office. As an adult still haunted by that night, he began to unpack the memories he had so long suppressed. And what he remembered was not a dream. It was a first-hand account of the Keddie murders. In his sessions, Justin painted a picture that was far more detailed and far more horrifying than anything he'd said under hypnosis. He remembered waking up, not to a dream, but to the real sounds of a struggle coming from the living room. He said he got up and looked out from the bedroom doorway. What he saw seared itself into his memory. He saw his stepfather, Marty Smart, and Marty's friend, a man named Bobu Bade, in the living room with Sue, Johnny, and Dana. An argument had broken out. Johnny had apparently seen Marty and Bo with Tina, and he was threatening to go to the police. The argument escalated, and Sue stepped in to defend Johnny. According to Justin's recovered memory, that's when the night turned into a bloodbath. He watched in horror as Bobu Bade grabbed Sue from behind, choking her. He saw Marty Smart grab a hammer from the fireplace. As Dana Wingate lunged to help Sue, Marty swung the hammer, striking Dana in the head. Dana fell, and Marty turned his rage on Johnny. Justin described seeing the 2 men overpowering Johnny and Dana, binding them with electrical cord and tape. He saw them use a knife. He saw things a 12-year-old should never see, things that would break any adult, let alone a child. Terrified, Justin said he retreated back into the bedroom, back to the safety of his sleeping bag, where he was found the next morning, pretending to be asleep, praying the monsters wouldn't come for him next. This wasn't a vague, dreamlike recollection anymore. This was a specific sequential account of the murders, naming the 2 men who had been in Cabin 26 that very night. It named the weapons. It provided a motive, silencing Johnny and Dana. It explained the specific brutality of the crime scene. It was the key that could potentially unlock the entire case. Justin's therapist was so convinced of the memory's authenticity, so disturbed by its contents, that he did what any responsible person would do. He wrote a letter. He sent it to the FBI and to local law enforcement, detailing everything his patient had recounted. He was handing them the solution to a 20-year-old cold case on a silver platter. And what did the authorities do with this explosive new testimony? The same thing they did in 1981. Nothing. The letter was filed away. The lead was ignored. For the second time, law enforcement had the account of an eyewitness, the only eyewitness, and they buried it. Why? Why would they ignore the one person who could put the killers in the room? The official explanation has always been a shrug. The memories were recovered under therapy years after the fact. They were unreliable. Justin's story had changed from his initial interview. It was the same logic they used to dismiss the hypnosis tapes. It was too messy, too convenient, too late. But let's think about that for a second. Is it really so strange that a traumatized 12-year-old boy would suppress the memory of watching his friends and their mother be brutally murdered by his own stepfather? Is it strange that his initial account would be confused and dreamlike? Or is that exactly what you would expect from a child's mind trying to protect itself from an unspeakable horror? The brain has a way of walling off memories that are too painful to process. It's a survival mechanism. It's not a lie. It's a shield. To dismiss Justin's account because it took years to surface isn't just cynical. It's a profound misunderstanding of how trauma works. The police had 2 men, Marty and Bo, who were there that night. They had a history of violence. Marty's own wife, Marilyn, had told police she suspected he was involved. And now they had an eyewitness account from Marty's own stepson, placing him and his accomplice at the scene, holding the murder weapons. This wasn't just a lead. It was a roadmap to a conviction. Yet, for decades, that map was locked away in a file cabinet, collecting dust. The question that hangs over this entire case, the one that chills you to the bone, isn't just who killed the Sharp family. It's why did the Plumas County Sheriff's Department seem so determined not to find out? Why ignore the eyewitness? Why dismiss the confessions? It starts to feel less like incompetence and more like something else. Something deliberate. Because Marty and Bo weren't just local troublemakers. Bo Bubade, in particular, had connections that ran deeper and darker than anyone in Keddie could have possibly imagined. And those connections may have been the very reason a 12-year-old boy's testimony was deemed worthless. Mansell Bo Bubaid wasn't just a drifter with a temper. He was, according to multiple sources including FBI files, a former enforcer for the Chicago outfit. This wasn't a man who got into bar fights. This was a man who allegedly made people disappear for a living. Born in 1928, he had a rap sheet that read like a career criminal's resume, including a prison stint at the notorious Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. After his release, he moved to Reno, Nevada, a city known for its shadowy underworld, and worked as a security guard at a casino, a job that often required the kind of skills he'd honed in organized crime. How does a man like that end up in a tiny, remote mountain community like Keddie, shacked up in a trailer with a local malcontent like Martin Smart? The official story is that they met at a VA hospital in Reno. Both were veterans, and they supposedly bonded over their shared experiences and struggles. But the connection seemed to run deeper than that. Smart, a man nursing a violent grudge, and Bubaid, a man with a history of professional violence, made for a terrifyingly combustible pair. To the locals, Bubaid was just Marty's strange friend from out of town. But to those who knew his past, his presence in Keddie was like a lit stick of dynamite waiting for a short fuse. And that fuse was about to be lit by Marty's estranged wife, Marilyn. This brings us to one of the most chilling and frustrating elements of the entire Keddie case: a direct confession. Not a rumor, not a whisper, but a detailed account of the crime, allegedly delivered by Martin Smart himself. Shortly after the murders, a distraught Marty went to see a counselor at the Feather River Mental Health Clinic. There, he reportedly unburdened himself, telling the counselor that he was responsible for Sue Sharp's death. He claimed he'd gone to Cabin 28 that night to confront Sue about her interference in his marriage, and that things had escalated. But his confession didn't stop there. He told the counselor that while he had killed Sue, it was his friend who had killed John and Dana. He never used Bubaid's name, but there was no one else it could have been. Think about that for a moment. A suspect in a quadruple homicide walks into a professional's office and admits to his role in the crime. In any normal investigation, this would be the breakthrough moment. This would be the lead that cracks the case wide open. The counselor, legally and morally obligated, did exactly what you'd expect. They immediately contacted the Plumas County Sheriff's Office and reported the confession. And what happened next? Absolutely nothing. No arrest. No follow-up interrogation of Marty Smart. No serious consideration of Bo Bubaid as a primary suspect. The sheriff's office, under the leadership of Sheriff Doug Thomas, essentially dismissed it. They claimed that Smart was a known drunk and a liar, that he was just trying to sound tough, and that his confession was unreliable. They treated a direct admission to murder with the same seriousness as barroom bragging. This is where the story shifts from a tragic, unsolved mystery to something far more sinister. Why would law enforcement ignore such a monumental lead? The answer, many believe, lies in the personal relationships within that small mountain community. Sheriff Doug Thomas was reportedly a personal friend of Martin Smart. They were drinking buddies. More than that, Bo Bubaid wasn't just some random ex-con. His connections to organized crime were real. A man like that doesn't operate in a vacuum. He has contacts, he has influence, and he knows how to make problems and people go away. Was the Plumas County Sheriff's Office simply incompetent? Or were they intimidated? Or, in the worst-case scenario, were they complicit? Suddenly, the dismissal of Justin Eason's testimony makes a terrifying kind of sense. If the sheriff's department was actively protecting Marty Smart, the last thing they wanted was a credible witness, even a 12-year-old boy, placing him at the scene of the crime. By discrediting Justin, by painting him as a confused kid on drugs, they could neutralize the only eyewitness who could corroborate the confession they were so eager to bury. The story of the confession doesn't end there. Gets even more damning. Marty's wife, Marilyn Smart, the very woman he was fighting with Sue over, was also aware of what he'd done. After Marty left Keddie, he wrote a letter to Marilyn. A letter that was so horrifying, it confirmed her deepest fears. In it, he allegedly wrote, "I've paid the price of your love and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives." 4 lives. The number was exact. This wasn't a vague, drunken boast. It was specific. Terrified and perhaps racked with guilt over her own role in the events leading up to the murders, Marilyn took the letter and went to the authorities. She wrote her own letter, addressed to Sheriff Doug Thomas, detailing Marty's confession to her, quoting his letter, and begging for something to be done. She laid out the entire motive: Marty's jealousy, his rage at Sue for counseling her to leave him, and the eruption of violence that followed. She named Marty and his friend as the killers. She handed over a written confession, from a primary suspect's own pen, implicating himself and his accomplice in the brutal murder of 4 people. It was the kind of evidence that detectives dream of. It was a signed, sealed, and delivered solution to the Keddie puzzle. And once again, the Plumas County Sheriff's Office did nothing. The letter vanished. It was never entered into the official case file. For decades, its very existence was denied. It was as if Marilyn Smart had never written it, and Martin Smart had never confessed. The case was allowed to grow cold, the evidence was allowed to degrade, and the killers were allowed to walk free. This wasn't just a series of mistakes or oversights. It was a pattern. A witness is discredited. A confession to a therapist is ignored. A confession in a letter is buried. Every single road that led to Martin Smart and Beau Bubaid was seemingly blocked by the very people sworn to patrol it. The investigation wasn't just stalled. It appears to have been deliberately sabotaged from the inside. The question was no longer just who killed the Sharp family and Dana Wingate. The question now was why. Why were these men so untouchable? What power did a small-town bully and a washed-up mob enforcer hold over an entire county's law enforcement? The answer reveals a level of corruption that allowed a pristine mountain cabin to become a slaughterhouse, and then ensured its secrets would stay buried in the cold Sierra soil for nearly 30 years. To understand the corruption, you have to understand the man at its center. He wasn't a kingpin or a political powerhouse. He was a neighbor. His name was Martin Smart. And on the surface, he was just another resident of Keddie, living in the adjacent Cabin 26 with his wife, Marilyn, and 2 friends. But Marty Smart was a man with deep, troubling connections, and an even more troubling story. Hours after the bodies were discovered, Marty approached investigators with a bizarre tale. He claimed he'd had a vivid dream, a premonition of the murders. He described details of the crime scene, things he couldn't possibly have known unless he was there. To a seasoned detective, this would be a flashing red light, a suspect practically screaming their own involvement. But in Plumas County in 1981, it was treated as a psychic vision from a helpful citizen. This was the first, and perhaps most blatant sign that the investigation was being steered away from Cabin 26. Living with Marty and Marilyn at the time was a man named John Bubaid, who went by Beau. If Marty Smart was the local problem, Beau Bubaid was the imported nightmare. Beau was not from the quiet mountains of Northern California. He was from Chicago. He had a rap sheet a mile long and boasted of connections to organized crime. He was a violent man, a known enforcer who had served time in federal prison. What was a man like this doing in a tiny remote resort town like Keddie? He claimed he was there for a VA counseling program, but the truth is, he was there because Marty Smart brought him there. The two had met at a VA hospital and became fast friends. And on the night of April 11th, this volatile, violent outsider was sleeping on the couch in the cabin right next door to the Sharps. The official police narrative for years was that the killers were unknown transients, phantoms who drifted in, committed an act of unspeakable violence, and drifted out. But the truth was festering right there in Keddie, and the person who held it was Marilyn Smart, Marty's wife. For months she lived in terror, silenced by threats from her own husband. But the weight of what she knew became unbearable. She finally broke down and confessed everything to her counselor. According to Marilyn, the night of the murders began with Marty and Beau growing increasingly agitated. They had been drinking heavily. She said Marty hated Johnny Sharp, blaming him for interfering in his marriage, for being a friend and confidant to Marilyn as she struggled with Marty's abusive behavior. That night, the hatred boiled over. Marilyn told her counselor that Marty and Beau left their cabin around 11:30 p.m., telling her they were going to teach Johnny a lesson. She watched them walk the few yards to Cabin 28. A short time later they returned, but they were changed. Their clothes were spattered with blood. Marilyn said Marty was holding a hammer, the same type of hammer later identified as a murder weapon. He allegedly turned to her, his eyes wild, and confessed. He told her he had killed Sue Sharp, but he didn't stop there. He said Johnny and his friend Dana had walked in on the attack, and that they had to be silenced too. This was it. a direct eyewitness account placing the two primary suspects at the scene, covered in blood, confessing to the crime. It was a gold-plated slam-dunk lead. The counselor, legally and morally obligated, immediately reported Marilyn's confession to the Plumas County Sheriff's Department. And what did they do with this explosive information? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The report was filed away. No follow-up interview was conducted with Marilyn. No search warrant was issued for Cabin 26. Marty Smart and Beau Bubaid were never brought in for serious interrogation based on this confession. It was as if the report never existed. Why? How could law enforcement ignore a confession in a quadruple homicide? The answer lies in the cozy relationship between the prime suspect and the man in charge, Sheriff Doug Thomas. Multiple sources, including former deputies and locals, have since confirmed that Marty Smart was a known informant for Sheriff Thomas. He was the sheriff's eyes and ears in the shadier parts of the county, feeding him information on drug deals and other criminal activity. This relationship gave Marty a get-out-of-jail-free card. He was more valuable to the sheriff as an asset on the street than as a suspect in a jail cell. Arresting your star informant for murder creates a massive political and logistical nightmare. It exposes the dirty deals made in the shadows of law enforcement. And it appears Sheriff Doug Thomas made a choice: sacrifice the truth of the Keddie murders to protect his own operation. This theory isn't just speculation. It explains the otherwise inexplicable failures of the investigation. It explains why Marty's dream was accepted at face value. It explains why his cabin wasn't searched. It explains why Marilyn's confession was buried. The entire investigation was compromised from the start because one of the killers was on the sheriff's payroll. Beau Bubaid, the violent outsider, was simply collateral. Protecting Marty meant protecting Beau too. The motive, which seems so elusive, begins to crystallize in this context. It wasn't random. It was personal. Marty Smart was an abusive and controlling husband. Sue Sharp, a strong and independent woman, had been encouraging Marilyn to leave him. She was offering her friend a way out. In Marty's twisted mind, Sue wasn't helping. She was interfering. She was a threat to his control. On that night, fueled by alcohol and egged on by a man with a history of brutal violence, Marty decided to eliminate that threat. Johnny and Dana were simply in the wrong place at the very worst time. Tragic witnesses to an explosion of domestic rage that escalated into a massacre. But there was another piece to Marilyn's confession, a detail that deepens the conspiracy. She claimed Marty and Beau weren't alone. She said another man was with them, someone they knew. She didn't name him, but she knew he was there. This aligns with evidence from the crime scene. The way the victims were bound suggested more than two attackers. One to control the victim, two to do the binding. Who was this third man? Was he another local pulled into the violence? Or was he part of the reason for the cover-up? After the murders, Marty Smart and Beau Bubaid didn't just walk free. They were practically given a police escort out of town. Marty quickly left California, sending a letter to Marilyn from Reno, a letter that was practically a second confession. In it, he wrote, "I've paid the price of your love and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives." This letter, another damning piece of evidence, was also turned over to the sheriff's department. And just like the confession, it vanished into a file ignored. Beau Bubaid also left Keddie, eventually dying in 1988. Marty Smart died in 2000. Sheriff Doug Thomas died in 1995. For decades, it seemed they had all taken their secrets to the grave. The perfect cover-up had worked. The case grew cold, buried under a mountain of deliberate incompetence and corruption. But they made one mistake. They wrote things down. And they couldn't imagine that one day, a new sheriff, a new detective, would come along and decide to finally read the files they tried so hard to keep closed. That new sheriff was Greg Hagwood. Elected in 2010, Hagwood wasn't a product of the old Plumas County political machine. He was an outsider, a former state investigator who looked at the mountains of cold cases in his new jurisdiction and saw not just tragedy, but a duty. And one case, one cabin, cast a longer, darker shadow than all the others. Keddie. He knew he couldn't tackle it alone. He needed someone with a specific set of skills. Someone relentless. Someone who knew the case, knew the players, and most importantly, knew how to read between the lines of a cold, neglected file. He found that man in Mike Gamberg, Gamberg was a seasoned investigator who had spent years working in Plumas County. He'd even been a deputy back in 1981. He remembered the whispers, the fear, the feeling that something was deeply wrong not just with the crime, but with the investigation itself. When Sheriff Hagwood handed him the Keddie files in 2013, it wasn't just a cold case assignment. It was an exorcism. For the first time in over 30 years, someone was looking at the evidence not to close the book, but to finally write the ending. Gamberg sat down with the boxes. The dusty yellow pages smelled of stale bureaucracy and secrets. And as he began to read, a slow burn of anger started in his gut. It wasn't just sloppy police work. It was, in his words, a colossal failure. Leads weren't just missed, they were ignored. Witness statements that pointed directly at the prime suspects were buried under irrelevant notes. Evidence was mishandled, documented poorly, or not at all. It was a roadmap of incompetence. But within that roadmap, Gamberg found something else. He found a path the original investigators had deliberately walked away from. And at the end of that path were two names, Martin Smart and Severin Beauboubaid. And then he found the letter. Tucked away in the files, a piece of evidence so potent it should have cracked the case wide open in 1981. It was a letter, handwritten by Martin Smart to his wife, Marilyn, sent just a short time after the murders. It wasn't a confession in the legal sense. It was something far more chilling. A poison pen love letter, filled with manipulation, self-pity, and veiled threats. But one line screamed out from the page. One line that, in the context of 4 brutal murders, was utterly terrifying. Marty wrote, "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through. Let that sink in. I've paid the price of your love with 4 people's lives." Gamberg stared at the words. How could this not have been the centerpiece of the entire investigation? This wasn't a clue, it was a neon sign. The original detectives had seen this letter. They had it in their possession. And they did nothing. They accepted Marty's flimsy explanation that it was just a turn of phrase, that he was speaking metaphorically about his life being ruined. But Gamberg saw it for what it was. The narcissistic ramblings of a killer, taunting the very person he committed the crime for. The price for Marilyn's love, in Marty's twisted mind, was the elimination of the people who were helping her leave him. Sue, Johnny, and Dana. And Tina, the witness, was the down payment on silence. This letter reframed everything. The motive wasn't random, it wasn't a drug deal gone wrong. It was personal. It was a crime of rage, of possessive homicidal fury. Sue Sharp had made the fatal mistake of offering Marilyn a safe place to stay, a way out from her abusive husband. And for that kindness, she and her children were slaughtered. Fueled by this discovery, Gamberg and Hagwood dug deeper. They re-interviewed Justin Smart, Marty's young stepson, who was in the cabin next door that night. As an adult, his memory was clearer, less clouded by the fog of childhood trauma and the intimidation of his stepfather. He confirmed what he tried to tell police back then. He saw Marty and Beau burning something in the wood stove in the early hours of the morning. He maintained he saw Tina Sharp with 2 men, one of them his stepfather, later that day, long after she was supposedly missing. The case was finally taking shape, but it was still a 30-year-old puzzle with most of the pieces missing. They had a motive, they had suspects, they had powerful circumstantial evidence. But they needed something physical. Something tangible that could bridge the decades and point a definitive finger. They needed a weapon. And then in 2016 the phone rang. A man was cleaning out a storage unit in rural Oregon. Inside he found a box belonging to a deceased relative. And in that box was another box, a locked toolbox. He pried it open. Nestled inside was a hammer. It was a standard claw hammer, but there was something about it that made the man pause. He had a vague memory, a story he'd heard about his relative, a man who had been friends with a murder suspect from a long-ago California crime. A story about a missing murder weapon. The man on the phone wasn't sure, but he had a gut feeling. He called the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. Gamberg drove to Oregon himself. He met the man, who explained that the toolbox had belonged to a local therapist. A therapist who, back in the early 80s, had Martin Smart as a patient. After the murders, Marty had apparently become overwhelmed with guilt and anxiety. He had confessed everything to this therapist. The murders, Beau's involvement, the weapons. The therapist, bound by patient confidentiality but terrified by what he knew, kept the secret. But at some point Marty Smart, paranoid and unstable, gave him the hammer. Perhaps as a threat, perhaps as a twisted cry for help. Gamberg held the hammer in his hands. It felt heavy not just with its own weight but with the weight of history. He examined it closely. It matched the description of a hammer that Marty had reported lost shortly after the murders. A hammer he claimed to have lost near a local pond. A pond that had been searched but not thoroughly enough. The hammer was sent to the California Department of Justice for analysis. They would search for any trace evidence, blood, hair, DNA, that might have survived the decades. It was a long shot. But for the first time there was more than just hope. There was a real physical object that could connect Martin Smart directly to the bloody crime scene in Cabin 28. But the hammer wasn't the only thing Marty confessed. He told his therapist that he wasn't the only one who used a hammer that night. He said Bo Bubaid used one too. And he said something else. Something that would once again change the entire direction of the investigation. He told the therapist that he and Bo hadn't been alone. There was someone else in the cabin with them. Someone younger. Someone who was still alive. And Gamberg, looking back through the files, through the old witness statements and flimsy alibis, thought he knew exactly who it was. The name wasn't a stranger's. It wasn't some shadowy figure pulled from a new tip line. It was a name that had been in the case file since day one. A name that was impossibly right there in the cabin when the killer struck. Justin Smart. Think about it. A 12-year-old boy, sleeping over with his friends in the loft of a small wooden cabin. On the other side of a thin wall, for people are being bludgeoned and stabbed to death with such ferocity that blood soaks through the floorboards. The attack is loud. It is violent. It is chaotic. And yet, Justin's official story, the one he told police in 1981, was that he slept through the entire thing. He didn't hear a scream. He didn't hear a struggle. He didn't hear a thing until he woke up the next morning to a scene from a slaughterhouse. For 30 years, that's where his story ended. He was the lucky one, the boy who slept. But Mike Gamberg didn't see a lucky survivor. He saw an impossibility. He saw a key that had been left in the lock unturned for 3 decades. He pulled the files on Justin, and that's when he found it. A transcript and then an audio recording of an interview conducted with Justin Smart just a few months after the murders. But it wasn't a normal interview. It was a session of hypnotic regression. By then, the investigation was completely stalled. Plumas County Sheriff's Office was desperate. They brought in a specialist, a hypnotist, hoping to unlock something, anything from Justin's subconscious. They put the boy under, and they asked him to go back to that night, to Cabin 28. The tape recorder was running, and what came out was not the story of a boy who slept. It was the story of a boy who saw everything. In the hushed, dreamlike voice of a child under hypnosis, a new timeline emerged. Terrifying one. Justin said he was awake. He heard a fight break out downstairs. He crept to the edge of the loft and peered down. He saw his mother, Sue, arguing with 2 men. He knew them. One was his own stepfather, Martin Smart. The other was Martin's friend, the one staying in the cabin next door, Severin Bo Bubaid. The argument escalated. It was about Sue wanting to end her affair with Marty. She wanted him out of her life. John Sharp, ever the protector, stepped in. He told Marty to leave his mother alone. And that's when it happened. In his hypnotized state, Justin described Marty grabbing a hammer. He described Bo pulling a knife. He watched in horror as the 2 men set upon John and his mother. He saw the first blows land. He saw the glint of the steel. Then he said the front door opened. It was Dana Holloway. He'd been walking home, saw the commotion, and ran inside to help his friend John. But he walked into an ambush. Marty and Bo turned on him, overpowering him, silencing him with the same brutal, senseless violence. According to Justin, the 3 of them, Sue, John, and Dana, were all killed in that initial furious explosion of rage. But the most chilling part of the recording was what Justin said happened next. After the initial frenzy, after the 3 bodies lay still on the living room floor, he saw another figure enter the cabin. He said it was his own mother, Marilyn Smart. He watched as Marilyn, with Bo Bubaid, went into the boys' bedroom where Tina Sharp was watching television, completely unaware of the carnage in the next room. Under hypnosis, a 12-year-old Justin Smart described watching his own mother and Bo Bubaid's mother, 14-year-old Tina Sharp, with a pillow, before carrying her small body out of the cabin and into the cold night. It was a confession, a full, detailed eyewitness account of the entire crime, naming the killers, the motive, the weapons, and the sequence of events. It explained everything. It explained why Dana was there. It explained the missing girl, Tina. It explained the relationship between the victims and the killers. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office had the entire solution on a cassette tape in 1981, and they did absolutely nothing with it. They dismissed it. They wrote it off as the fantasy of a traumatized child, the unreliable product of hypnosis. They had a roadmap to the killers, and they folded it up and filed it away in a box, where it sat collecting dust for 32 years. Until Mike Gamberg pressed play. For Gamberg, listening to that tape wasn't just a breakthrough. It was a thunderclap. It recontextualized every piece of evidence. The hammer found at the scene, Marty's weapon, the steak knife, bows, the electrical and medical tape used to bind the victims. It was the exact same type of tape Marty Smart, a VA hospital worker, used at his job. Everything clicked. But a 32-year-old hypnosis tape, no matter how compelling, wouldn't be enough. He needed more. He needed corroboration. And then he got it. In 2016, a therapist contacted the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. He said years earlier, he had a patient who was tormented by a dark secret from his childhood. The patient's name was Justin Smart. The therapist told Gamberg that a now-adult Justin had confessed the exact same story to him, not under hypnosis, but in a series of therapy sessions. He told him he had witnessed the murders. He named his stepfather, Marty Smart, and Bo Bubaid as the killers. He said he saw them murder Sue, John, and Dana. And he repeated the most horrific detail of all, that he watched his own mother, Marilyn, help murder Tina Sharp. The therapist said Justin was living in a state of constant terror, convinced that if he ever told anyone, he would be next. He was the loose end, the one person who could connect them all to the crime. This was the corroboration Gamberg needed. A second confession, decades apart, but identical in every crucial detail. The story wasn't a fantasy. It was a memory so horrific it had been buried for years under layers of trauma and fear. And then came the final piece, the linchpin. While combing through old evidence, Gamberg found a letter. It was sent to Marty Smart shortly after the murders. It was from his wife, Marilyn. It was postmarked from Reno, Nevada, just after she'd abruptly left Keddie. The letter was rambling, a mix of affection and paranoia, but one line jumped off the page. One line that made the hair on Gamberg's arms stand up. Marilyn wrote to Marty, quote, "I've paid the price for your love and it's cost me my daughter's life." My daughter's life. Marilyn didn't have a daughter. The only young girl in her life, the one she was known to be close to, was Tina Sharp. Gamberg read the line again. "I've paid the price for your love and it's cost me my daughter's life." It wasn't just a clue. It felt like a signature on a confession to helping cover up, or even participate in, the murder of Tina Sharp, just as her son Justin had claimed twice. Suddenly Gamberg had it all. He had an eyewitness. He had a corroborated confession. He had a motive, a lover's quarrel that spiraled into a homicidal rage. He had the killers, Marty Smart and Bo Bubaid. He had a likely accomplice in Marilyn Smart. He had physical evidence that now made perfect sense. After 35 years, the brutal, baffling crime finally had answers. The ghosts of Keddie Cabin 28 finally had names for their killers. The case that had been ice-cold for a generation was suddenly, undeniably, solved. But there was one massive problem. The men responsible, Martin Smart and Bo Bubaid, were already in their graves. And the only living witness to their crime was about to disappear. Marilyn Smart didn't vanish into thin air. She didn't flee the state or go into hiding. What disappeared was her testimony. The one voice that could have put her husband behind bars for life was silenced, not by a threat, but by the slow, grinding machinery of the legal system and the deep-seated terror that had ruled her life for years. After revealing everything to that investigator, the case didn't explode into the headlines. There were no immediate arrests. Instead, there was a chilling silence. And in that silence, Marilyn's resolve crumbled. When officially questioned later, her story changed. She recanted. She claimed she couldn't remember. The official record would show an inconsistent witness, an unreliable narrator. But the truth was far simpler and far more tragic. She was a terrified woman who had finally spoken up, only to find herself standing alone, with no shield against the man she had just accused of mass murder. The system she had put her faith in had failed to act, and the window of opportunity, that brief moment of courage, slammed shut. For the investigators, it was a dead end. The one person who saw it all was now a closed book. And with that, the Keddie case plunged back into the abyss, colder and darker than ever before. For decades it stayed that way. A local horror story, a cautionary tale, a stain on the soul of Plumas County. The files gathered dust. The suspects, Martin Smart and Beau Bubaid, lived out their lives, never once facing a single charge for the atrocities of Cabin 28. Smart died of cancer in 2000. Bubaid died in Chicago in 1988. The case, for all intents and purposes, was dead too. Until 2010. That's when a new sheriff was elected in Plumas County. His name was Mike Gamberg, and he was a man with a long memory. He'd been a deputy in a neighboring county back in '81, and the sheer brutality of the Keddie murders had never left him. He, like so many others, had heard the rumors, the whispers about a botched investigation and suspects who were allowed to walk free. When he took office, he made a promise. He was going to reopen the Keddie case, and he was going to follow the evidence wherever it led, no matter whose reputation it destroyed. He assigned a dedicated investigator, Mike Larsh, and together, they descended into the archives. They pulled out the old case files, boxes and boxes of them, filled with faded photographs, brittle reports, and interviews that hadn't been looked at in 30 years. They weren't just looking for clues, they were conducting an autopsy on the original investigation itself. And what they found was staggering. They found the letter from Martin Smart's therapist, the one detailing the confession, buried deep in the files, seemingly ignored. They found Marilyn's original terrified statements, which lined up perfectly with what Justin had seen. They started re-interviewing everyone they could find who was still alive. They tracked down the man who had been friends with Martin Smart, the one he drove to Reno with just days after the murders. His name was Don Stoy. And when Gamberg's investigator sat down with him, the story he told was chilling. Stoy confirmed that Marty and Beau had been at the Keddie resort that night. He confirmed that Marty had an irrational, violent hatred for Sue Sharp. Most disturbingly, he remembered Marty talking obsessively about murder. Not just the Keddie murders, but another unsolved murder in the area. Stoy recalled Marty looking him dead in the eye and saying, "I killed the B word, and I'll kill anyone else who gets in my way." The pieces were all there, scattered across 30 years of neglect. Gamberg and Larsh were simply the first ones willing to put them together. And then they got a phone call that changed everything. A man had been sweeping the area around Keddie with a metal detector. He was searching near a place called Spanish Creek, not far from the resort. His machine let out a scream and he started to dig. A few inches down, he pulled a rusty, mud-caked object from the earth. It was a hammer. A claw hammer, to be specific. Remembering the stories about the Keddie murders, he called the sheriff's office. When Gamberg and Larsh looked at it, their blood ran cold. The hammer was a perfect match for the type of weapon described in the autopsy reports. A weapon that had never been found. They went back to the old files, digging through every interview, every scrap of paper. And there it was. An interview with Martin Smart from June of 1981. In it, the deputy asks him if he owns any weapons. Smart says no, but then he's asked if he's missing any tools. And Martin Smart admits that yes, he recently lost a hammer. He said it had gone missing just a few weeks prior, around the same time as the murders. The exact same type of hammer that had just been pulled from the ground a stone's throw from the crime scene. It felt like a message from the grave. This wasn't just a potential murder weapon. This was a direct link to their prime suspect. But the biggest bombshell was yet to come. As Gamberg and his team continued their work, they received another call. It was from a man who had known Martin Smart. He told them something that had been kept secret for over 3 decades. He said that back in 1981, Smart's therapist hadn't just written a letter to the police. He had done something more. Fearing for his own safety and tormented by what he'd been told, the therapist had convinced Martin Smart to repeat his confession while a tape recorder was running. A tape. A recording of the killer, in his own words, describing what he did. The man on the phone claimed the tape still existed. For Gamberg, this was the holy grail. After a frantic search, the tape was located. It had been sitting in a box, a forgotten relic of a forgotten crime. They took it back to the office and pressed play. And out of the speakers came the voice of Martin Smart. The audio was grainy, the quality poor, but the words were unmistakable. On the tape, Smart admits his hatred for Sue Sharp. He talks about her interfering in his marriage to Marilyn. He doesn't give a full, detailed, play-by-play confession of the entire night. Killers rarely do. It's disjointed. He's agitated, paranoid. He talks around the specifics using vague language. But then he says it. He talks about Sue and he says, quote, "I've paid the price of your love." A cryptic, chilling phrase. But the therapist pushes him. And Smart admits that he, along with another person, is responsible for the death of Sue Sharp. He never names Beau Bubaid on the tape, but the implication is clear. He talks about Dana, about how Dana discovered him and Sue fighting and how things escalated. He admits that Dana's death was not part of the plan. It was collateral damage. A witness who had to be silenced. Listening to that tape, Gamberg and Larsch finally had it. This was the smoking gun. The confession, direct from the killer's mouth. They now had a coherent, terrifying timeline of events. Martin Smart, enraged by Sue's attempts to help his wife Marilyn leave him, recruits his friend Beau Bubaid, a man with deep ties to organized crime in Chicago, a man who knew how to handle violence. They go to Cabin 28 that night with a singular, brutal purpose: to silence Sue Sharp permanently. But they aren't expecting anyone else to be there. John and Dana are a surprise. Complication. When Dana walks in and sees the attack on his mother, he tries to intervene. In the ensuing chaos, he and John are overpowered and killed. Tina, awakened by the screams, is taken from the scene, likely by Bubaid, to be dealt with elsewhere, a loose end he knew how to tie up from his time in the mob. It was a targeted assassination that spiraled into a massacre. The evidence was overwhelming. They had the witness, Marilyn, whose original statement detailed the crime. They had the other witness, Justin, whose sketch of one of the killers was a dead ringer for Beau Bubaid. They had the hammer, a weapon Smart admitted to losing at the exact time of the murders, found right where you'd expect a killer to toss it. And now they had the confession on tape. After 35 years, Sheriff Mike Gamberg held a press conference. He announced to the world that the Keddie Cabin murders were officially solved. The men responsible were Martin Smart and Beau Bubaid. It was a landmark moment. Justice, it seemed, had finally arrived. But as the relief washed over the community, it was quickly replaced by a darker, more unsettling realization. Identifying the killers was one thing, but the tape, the hammer, the witness statements, most of this information wasn't new. It had all been available, in some form or another, back in 1981. It had been ignored, buried. The question was no longer who killed the Sharp family. The question was why the men who knew the answer let the killers walk free. The murders in Cabin 28 were the work of 2 men. But the cover-up, that would have required many more. And in a town as small as Quincy, a town where everyone knew everyone, where the sheriff was on a first-name basis with the citizens he was sworn to protect, a cover-up was not only possible, it was probable. Plumas County in 1981 wasn't a sprawling metropolis with anonymous faces. It was a tight-knit community, bound by shared histories and in some cases shared secrets. Sheriff Doug Thomas wasn't just the lead investigator. He was a friend of Marty Smart. They knew each other. They moved in the same circles. And when a man like that is accused of something so heinous, the instinct for some isn't to pursue justice, but to protect one of their own. This wasn't a sophisticated conspiracy orchestrated in the shadows. It was something far more common and far more insidious. It was a good old boys network closing ranks. It was a series of small, deliberate decisions. The decision to not treat Marty Smart as a suspect, despite his violent history and proximity to the crime. The decision to ignore Marilyn Smart's terrified pleas for help, and her direct implication of her husband. The decision to dismiss the eyewitness account of the children who saw Marty and another man on the night of the murders. Each decision on its own could be explained away as a mistake, as incompetence. But together, they form an undeniable pattern of willful negligence. Think about the therapist's letter. A confession, written by a man tormented by what he'd done, sent directly to the man in charge of finding the killer. And that man, Sheriff Doug Thomas, was friends with the killer. The letter didn't just get misplaced. It was made to disappear. It was a smoking gun, and the sheriff himself buried it. The same goes for the 911 call from the payphone. A recording that could have contained the voice of a suspect or a crucial witness, a piece of evidence that is standard procedure to preserve, simply vanished. It's a level of incompetence so profound, it can only be interpreted as intentional. The entire investigation was a masterclass in how not to solve a crime. The crime scene was a chaotic free-for-all, contaminated by dozens of people before it was ever properly processed. Evidence that was collected, like the bloody knife, was handled so poorly its forensic value was destroyed. And the most crucial piece of evidence, the murder weapon itself, the hammer, wasn't even found by police. It was discovered by a man years later, dredged from the bottom of a pond, a location investigators should have searched on day one. While the wheels of justice were grinding to a halt in Plumas County, the killers were simply allowed to move on. Marty Smart, the man at the center of it all, left Keddie shortly after the murders. He moved to Reno, enlisted in the military, and attempted to build a new life, all while the specter of Cabin 28 hung over him. He was a man running from his own demons, a secret he confided to his therapist and, in moments of rage, threatened his own wife with. He died of cancer in 2006, a free man, having never spent a single day in jail for the slaughter he orchestrated. His suspected accomplice, Severin Beau Bubaid, also vanished from the area. A man with alleged ties to organized crime in Chicago, a man who was a stranger in town, brought there by Marty. He was the perfect muscle, the perfect partner for such a brutal act. He died in 1988, also a free man, his role in the murders nothing more than a footnote in a mishandled case file. And what of Marilyn Smart? She was not an accomplice but another victim. A victim of Marty's abuse for years, and a victim of a system that failed to protect her. After Marty confessed to her that he had killed Sue and Johnny, he threatened her, telling her she'd be next if she ever spoke a word. She lived in a prison of fear, a silence she finally broke years later, long after it could have made a difference in a court of law. Her story paints a chilling picture of the night. Marty and Beau, fueled by rage and alcohol, leaving their cabin with murder in mind, and returning hours later, covered in the blood of their victims. For decades, the case file for the Keddie murders gathered dust. It became a local ghost story, a dark chapter in the town's history that most people wanted to forget. The families of Sue, Johnny, Dana, and Tina were left in a state of agonizing limbo, with no answers, no closure, and no justice. But then, a new generation of investigators came along. In 2013, Plumas County Sheriff Greg Hagwood, who was just a teenager when the murders occurred, reopened the case. He assigned it to a determined investigator, Mike Gamberg, who brought fresh eyes and modern technology to a crime that had been frozen in time. Gamberg, haunted by the case his entire career, began methodically sifting through the mountain of old files, re-interviewing witnesses, and re-examining the evidence. And he found things. He found the therapist's letter, buried deep in the case files, confirming everything investigators had been told for years. He located the hammer, the one found in the pond, and sent it for DNA testing. He publicly named Marty Smart and Beau Bubaid as the primary suspects, officially confirming what many had known all along. He acknowledged the failures of the original investigation, calling it shocking and disappointing. The modern investigation gave a name to the evil, but the damage had been done. The trail was cold. The suspects were dead. DNA evidence, after so many years of poor storage and contamination, could point in the right direction but struggled to provide the slam-dunk proof needed for a prosecution, had the suspects even been alive. So we are left with the most likely and most tragic of stories. This wasn't a random home invasion. It was deeply personal. Sue Sharp, in her kindness, had become a confidant for Marilyn Smart. She was counseling her, encouraging her to leave her abusive husband. Marty Smart saw this not as an act of friendship, but as an interference, a threat to his control. On the night of April 11, 1981, fueled by rage and with his violent friend Beau Bubaid at his side, he went to Cabin 28 to silence the woman who dared to challenge him. Sue was the target. Johnny and Dana were simply in the way. Tragic collateral damage in Marty's explosion of violence. Tina was the loose end. She was a witness. She likely woke up during the commotion, saw the faces of the men who were killing her family. In their panicked escape, they couldn't leave her behind. Her abduction wasn't planned. It was a desperate act to ensure their own survival. They drove her miles away, to the remote woods of Camp 18, and ended her life, burying their final secret in the cold, hard ground. Her skull, found 3 years later, was the final heartbreaking piece of a puzzle that law enforcement had refused to solve. Today, Cabin 28 is gone. It was demolished in 2004, a physical attempt to erase a stain that could never be washed away. The Keddie Resort itself has fallen into disrepair, a ghost of its former self. The men responsible for the murders are dead, having escaped justice on this earth. The men responsible for the cover-up, for the decades of silence and pain, have largely escaped accountability. The Keddie Cabin murders remain, officially, unsolved. But they are not a mystery. We know who did it and we know why they got away with it. The story isn't about a phantom killer who vanished into the night. It's about the very real, very human monsters who lived next door, and the system that chose to look the other way. It is a chilling reminder that sometimes, the most terrifying darkness isn't found in a remote, isolated cabin, but in the hearts of men who value loyalty over justice and silence over truth. The ghosts of the Sharp family don't just haunt the empty space where Cabin 28 once stood. They haunt the conscience of a community that let their killers walk free.